Hello, I'm Ariel Kroon.
And I'm Christina Rocha.
Welcome to Season 4 of Solarpunk Presents,
the podcast introducing you to the people working today to create a future we'd like to live in.
Because if solarpunk as a genre of fiction dreams about the just and sustainable world we'd like to live in the future,
solarpunk as a movement rolls up its sleeves and gets down to the business of bringing it about in the present.
We hope you enjoy this episode, but first, we need your support.
Come join our Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents for all sorts of good stuff like bonus clips, dispatches, photo essays, and early access to episodes.
Or you can spread the word by writing our podcast a review or recommending us to a friend, or you can do both.
And be sure to visit our beautiful new website and catch up on our blog at solarpunkpresents.com.
And now, on to the episode.
Welcome to Season 4, Episode 6 of Solarpunk Presents.
This is Ariel, and today I'm talking with Navarre Bartz about spirituality in solarpunk. You might know Navarre as the person behind the Solarpunk Station blog, which recently ran a series of guest posts focusing on different aspects of solarpunk spirituality. This piqued our interest since Christina and I are both very unfamiliar with how the concept of solarpunk and the concept of spirituality fit together. Navarre, thank you for coming on the podcast today to speak with me.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Awesome.
I lurk and listen a lot. So.
Oh, that's great. Could you actually start off by introducing yourself to our listeners a little bit?
Okay, so I'm Navarre Bartz. As you said, I run the Solarpunk Station blog and occasional video on YouTube. I have a background in materials science and ceramic engineering. Most of my research was energy materials, but ceramic engineers do everything from toilets to solar panels, so anything in that tech spectrum, or, clay pots. I found out about solarpunk, I think, like a lot of people in the mid-20 teens, kind of found it through steampunk and some appropriate technology things from No Tech magazine, and that piqued my interest. Also from the maker movement, that was all kind of a confluence there. I guess as far as solarpunk spirituality goes, mostly I just got some people who are smarter than me together to write things on my blog. I'm probably the least qualified because I went to Catholic school growing up, so I have 13 years of Catholic theology. It's very more domination and oppression based, maybe. Most actual people are great, but the church maybe doesn't have the best history with solarpunk ideals.
I was going to ask, so what is solarpunk spirituality to you specifically? I mean, could you give us a bit of a 101 style definition?
Coming into solarpunk, one of the things that I found interesting about it was often people have this diametric opposition in their head that science and spirituality are at each other's throats and can't coexist. But one of the things that I felt like even early on solarpunk expressed was that science and spirituality can coexist and also reinforce each other. And for me, having one without the other, you either end up with unbridled capitalism under science where everything is very clockwork and it doesn't really matter what happens to other people or beings on the planet. And if you don't have that scientific basis, you can end up with bigotry, and you can still end up with negative consequences by not having at least some scientific or other more grounded worldview that's kind of down to earth and not 100%, oh, this physical plane is not important kind of thing.
That's a really fascinating point of view, and something that I'd been thinking about as well, or just through encounters in my life, the whole science and spirituality seeming to be diametrically opposed. I also grew up religious, and so having that sort of ideology sort of propelled at me if you believe, then you automatically have to discount these scientific theories. And if you are involved in science in any way, then you can't be spiritual, or else somehow it's contaminated. And so what I like about solarpunk is that it sort of brings those together, and it has room for bringing that together, and room for people who don't care about bringing that together, but also room for people who do very much. I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more about what prompted you to have that Solarpunk Spirituality blog series of guest posts. What sort of made you think this is something that I want to put out into the world?
It's been a while now, so I can't. This will be me trying to remember things from a year or two ago. But I think I've been thinking a little bit about this in my own life. I'd been Christian up until a few years ago, and then we had a kid on the way, so I was kind of evaluating some of my own moral frameworks, and I was like, actually not, some of it is still very important to me, but the whole package didn't fit what I actually felt. And some of it was things are just changing as turning into an adult, if I'm so bold as to call myself one. And okay, what fits and what doesn't fit. And some of these things are things that kind of, I guess, chafed over my entire life, and some are just ways I've changed. That kind of led me to, okay, there are actually lots of different ways of looking at the spiritual dimensions of life and what else is out there. I kind of wanted to address that a little bit on the blog, but it's a very big topic, so I didn't want to go out and stomp my person who was raised as a white male feet all over that without bringing in some other people. I went ahead and started reaching out. I knew a few people, and also kind of threw out a wide net on what was then still Twitter and Mastodon, and asked if anybody else was interested, and had a few people respond. We talked together and kind of decided how we wanted to structure it, and ended up just doing kind of individual essays on how them being part of Solarpunk and Lunarpunk interfaced with their own spiritual practices or experiences. Just as a caveat, not just in the religious, because we also have at least a couple contributors who are also atheist or agnostic, probably depending on what day you ask them, maybe. I think I have a more specific definition I use on the blog, which I might see if I can find in my introduction post. Basically, the idea that spirituality is kind of a catch-all for that weird things we can't explain for science, through science, like all the squishy bits of humanity. I'll read the official one too, and we can decide which one sounds better. So I have an asterisk on my introduction post of, I'm defining spirituality here as all the squishy and difficult to define things that make us human. This includes the paths followed by everybody, atheists, pagans, Abramists, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, and everybody.
I really like that definition.
It's evolving. It's a holding pattern for now, so we'll see. And hopefully we have one or two more people coming in too, and obviously it's a conversation with the whole Solarpunk community, and my blog is only one teeny tiny part of the whole. And I think one thing that I didn't mention earlier too is that all those different paths, it's sort of the, I guess, pluralism of everyone's looking at the same thing maybe, but from different angles, and we're better off working together instead of saying there's only the one correct way to look at this and everyone else is wrong.
Have you encountered anybody who self-describes himself as Solarpunk, who says, like you have to adhere to certain spiritual belief set or practices, or is it fairly multivocal in this way?
I don't think I've run into anyone who's very dogmatic in that way, and I think that's the punk aspect of Solarpunk, is anything that strays toward hierarchy or dogma or things can only be one way is kind of, I'm sure if you explore the gray area between Solarpunk and eco-fascism, there are probably some people in there, and definitely on the eco-fascist side, but I think the attractor for Solarpunk is more pluralism and more community and working together, not despite, but because of our differences, we're better together, as opposed to working in opposition to each other, or saying that there's only one way to do it right. Not that we don't have those conversations, but I haven't seen it in a spiritual context, at least.
Yeah, that's definitely what attracts me to this idea of Solarpunk spirituality, is sort of a quilted kind of patchwork or mosaic kind of bringing together of all these different facets, because I certainly don't know everything. And so it's great to be able to learn from other people. Christina and I actually discussed in our very first episode of the podcast that often solarpunk manifestos can kind of read a little bit like religious tenets, a lot of thou shalt not, and in order to be a true solarpunk trademark, you should believe X, Y, Z, right? So I was wondering what your take was on that.
There's always a certain amount of wanting to do that and being like, oh, well, you believe this certain thing, so obviously you're not. The whole no true solar punk or no true Scotsman sort of argument. And I feel like that's not, like, we could do that all day, but that's not going to get us much of anywhere. I was just at a convention, and one of the panelists, I believe he's a cartoonist, but his name's Goni Montes, which I'm probably pronouncing badly because I can speak tiny bit of Spanish, but anyway, they were talking about how for lack of a better term, I'm paraphrasing here, but the agents of the status quo are very consolidated and tend to overlook a lot of their differences, like the weird alliance in the United States, at least between like big business and evangelical Christians, even though if you look at like the Bible and stuff, that does not make sense as an alliance, but it's a thing politically here in the United States. So the agents of the status quo are very, very consolidated, I think is the word he used. They'll do what's necessary to keep things kind of as it is. And solarpunk is very much about change to what we view as a better future. So without jumping too much into the left-right paradigm, but there's a lot of discourse about the left trying to eat itself and trying not to do that, and solarpunk, I think, would be a better way forward. I'm also kind of conflict averse, so that's my natural tendency, is to try to, okay, we'll just agree to disagree on that thing, but let's work together on this other part that we're working on right now. Not that I can't get angry and irrational about things at times. I'm still human.
I mean, that's fair. I think that too. And also part of what I like about solarpunk is that it acknowledges that I guess people are human, and acknowledging that humans do have a spiritual side, or a side of them that can't really be explained away, as you say, the squishy bits that science can't really quantify. How do you see solarpunk spirituality working into this vision of a better future that solarpunk has? So I mean, we've all seen the pictures of like walkable, sustainable communities and stuff like that. And there's a lot of focus on this sort of like the physical design. And spirituality is, well, it's not physical, it's metaphysical. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
First, I guess to tie it in a little bit with that architectural aspect, one of the stories, and I can't remember the name, one of the stories in Bioluminescent, the anthology, the Lunarpunk anthology that came out last year. It might have been called Neptune's Dew. They're on an underwater, I want to say space station, but it's an ocean station, I guess. One of the characters gets there. They go with a friend, and they're both grad students kind of thing. And I don't think it's a spoiler that when they get there, they're kind of surprised because this is a science research outpost, but they find little altars to different either deities or saints, as the case may be. And there are all these little alcoves in this one area. And they're like, well, this is a scientific station. Why are there all these like religious things? And they're from all these different aspects around the world. And the people are like, well, when you're in the ocean, like there's a lot that could happen. So you're going to take all the help you can get, kind of thing. I think to some extent, that's why there's sort of the stereotype of sailors being superstitious and all these sort of things.
No atheists in the trenches or foxholes or something. That saying, I can't remember.
Yeah,
Anyways,
exactly. Yeah, because the ocean will mess you up if it wants to and not even notice. So, but just in general too, like as far as like one of the aspects of the 10,000 of solarpunk is also trying to integrate humanity back into, like, remove that separation we've developed from the natural world as if we're not part of it. And I think there is a spiritual dimension to that, both in, like, especially in a lot of the pagan paths are more nature based. if I had to label myself right now, I'd probably consider myself a druid. Obviously, not the Solarpunk druid because that's another guy. That's Craig. Anyway, there's a lot more of a nature focus, and I think that would also come out in the architecture. Like you see it to some extent in some of the images and things of Solarpunk. I think one of the important spiritual, back to the kind of squishy bits, is remembering what I think we knew for a long time, that the natural world and other animals and plants and creatures are also here and coexisting and living. And I feel like, and this is me not knowing that I'm an inorganic kind of person, but my understanding of what we know neurology and biology wise is it's still a little fuzzy on how we went from rocks to bacteria. Like that jump was kind of like wild. So, and then everything else kind of went from there. Like bacteria are different than us, but mostly the same. Like that part, and where we get consciousness, like is it conscious or is it not? My understanding of some indigenous traditions, and I'm not indigenous, so huge caveat there, is that everything has some degree of consciousness. And my understanding is there's a growing movement in Western philosophy, at least right now, that maybe that's not so crazy. And of course, the indigenous people I've heard on podcasts and stuff are like, yeah, we told you guys that a long time ago, and you told us we were stupid. And we're like, maybe we're not. It's very much a lot of it is we thought we knew better, and it turns out we didn't. But we can address the whole baggage that's Western society later, maybe. But it touches on everything, unfortunately. As we try to reintegrate humans into nature, I think there's definitely a spiritual aspect of how are we connected to the other living things on the earth, and how do we respect them even if we're not able to communicate with them. And there was another story, I think that was in Bioluminescent, that Bright Flame had a story, which she wrote an article for me for the Solarpunk Spirituality series, where there are witches that go around and like they have different specialties, and some people talk to mycorrhizae and some people talk to trees, and they have like a special thing they can communicate like telepathically with, which is cool.
So a Solarpunk future then would sort of be more integrated, I guess. So this,
yeah,
I guess, bringing together that false separation between humans and the natural world. And so a Solarpunk spirituality seeks to sort of bring that more together. Okay.
That's my interpretation of it. Again, like all of this is just my particular take on it, but that I think that would be an important aspect of it, because I think if you look at most religions, especially as you go back further, pre-industrial society, religions all have at least some aspect of nature is an important part. And in some of them, you start to see maybe there's a separation or dominion over this natural world by humans, but it's always still an important aspect. And in day-to-day life in big cities, sometimes you may not see that anymore. And it's easy to get in that mindset that there are humans over here and there's nature over there. One thing some people talk about is maybe there have been phases whether the climate movement has been focused on, oh, let's save polar bears, or now some people are like, oh, we have to save humans and maybe we won't care as much about animals now. It should probably be both.
The recognition that you can't really have one without the other.
And that's another thing I feel like spirituality at its best anyway is maybe more systems thinking than at least traditional, the way we think of at least Western science has been, which is very reductive. And okay, we're going to take this one thing, we're going to take it out of its environment and we're going to look at it, which is definitely a useful thing to do because it's hard to study things like in the wild. But like you can pull it out and study it, but it doesn't necessarily act the same way, which I mean, we see in quantum physics just from like the observer effect. By looking at something, you're changing it, and it's true, like maybe not in the same mathematically quantifiable way, but it's also a thing that happens. Like if you're watching animals in the forest, even they're still in their environment, but they're probably also knowing that you're there, which is probably going to make them act a little differently than if you weren't. But
For sure. I mean, even with humans, if there's a security camera and we know we're being surveilled, we're going to act a little bit differently than
Mm-hmm.
if we think that we're completely alone. And in fact, a lot of places kind of rely on that technology to discipline people into acting a certain way, compliance and stuff like that. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a principle I think that extends beyond the human. And so it, yeah, just sort of seems like a no-brainer for it to be applicable to science and the scientific method when they're studying things that are not human. Going back to, we mentioned solarpunk architecture and you mentioned those altars in that story. And I was wondering if you've ever thought of, I don't want to say solarpunk churches, but solarpunk places of worship. Do you think that there's room for that within a solarpunk city? Or do you think that veers a little bit too much towards institutionalization?
I think there could be. I mean, I think, at least in my head, like I know institutions can definitely come with a lot of baggage. I knew someone in my old town who was very anti-institutionalizing anything. I think pretending like we can get rid of any of that stuff is probably veers too much into that overly optimistic that we get sometimes accused of in solar punk. But at least in my view, there probably would still be different. I assume that different versions of Christian churches and synagogues and things like that are still going to exist in the future, unlike in Star Trek, where you don't see any of that. And the only time that anything remotely similar happens is when you're on DS9 and they have the Bajoran people with their worship system. And even then, it's still like, oh, well, they're those weird aliens who have religion. But we've gotten rid of all that, which is honestly kind of weird. But I think we'll still see things like that. I would like to see just in general, because I'm like this, where I like smaller groups of people gathering instead of like, I'm hoping we won't see mega churches where there are like 10,000 people, because there's no real, in my own personal moralizing, I guess, I don't know, my own personal view of things, you're a lot better off. The important aspects of having like a faith community instead of practicing on your own are those actual community aspects. And you don't really get that if you're above Dunbar's number of like 100 to 200 people. It gets a lot harder to form social connections and be able to reinforce those and work together as a community toward anything more than just sometimes getting on board like the groupthink train.
For
So I'd
sure.
like to see maybe smaller places of worship, kind of like in Japan. They have all the, I don't drink, but my understanding, and I've never been to Japan, but my understanding is from what I've read of Japanese urban design, is there are lots of little hole in the wall restaurants and bars and things like that because of the way they've done their zoning over there. Like you can have a small restaurant or something that's like maybe downstairs from your apartment or something,
Mm.
but like all the way kind of diffused into the social fabric. So you might have a little hole in the wall place of worship, and maybe it gets used for multiple things. So on one day of the week, this religion, or well, hopefully not. We can, sure, religion.
Such a loaded word, eh?
Yeah, I'm like, maybe I don't want to say religion because that has a certain, again, that institutionalization. But
Mm.
um, I assume there will be religions in the future too, but ideally more groups of people working together toward a common goal kind of thing. Just because once you institutionalize something, and I'm not going to tell anyone anything new here, and it's not my area of study by any means, since again I'm an engineer, not a not a philosopher, except I pretend to be one on the internet. Institutionalizing something kind of freezes it with, okay, this is not even just over time with different people, but even with just those people, it's like I was thinking this one thing in this one moment, but now I'm going to write it down and say this is the way things are, and
Mm.
that kind of makes it hard to change, which I think change is one of the underlying things that's important to solar punk is changing toward
Mm.
a better future, and also changing that connection with nature and growth, but also not forgetting that, which capitalism has forgotten. Capitalism loves to grow. It's got the growth thing down, but
Mhm.
it forgets that sometimes things need to die,
Mm.
and there's a cyclical nature to everything.
Mm.
And so, and that's another aspect that spirituality addresses that science doesn't really address, is like, we know things die. And at least from my understanding, when I read a long time ago, so this, take it with a grain of salt, I might be misquoting here, but when I read Mary Roach's book Stiff, it's all about death and ways people die and what happens to your body and all that stuff. But they're like, we're not really 100% sure. Like, obviously, if you get blown up, that's a pretty obviously why you stopped working. But sometimes it's just like, we don't know why the body stopped working. It just kind of like, meh. And so a lot of this stuff, like in science, a lot of the time, the more science you do, the more answers you get. 2 questions for every answer or more.
Especially when it comes to the topic of the afterlife. I think the whole thing is one giant question mark for a lot of people who do spend time thinking about it. And it's one of the, I think, driving factors behind this pull towards spirituality, perhaps, or even institutionalization. People want something to sort of grab onto. In Solarpunk, though, I am not sure what sort of the death rituals might be like. I assume it probably will be different for every community, but would you speak on that a bit?
One of the things I've seen that's kind of newer, at least IRL, is there are a few companies working on doing something more like rapid composting of bodies, where I think they're out in the Pacific Northwest right now. At least one company is doing. I think there might be another, where they I think they rapid freeze dry you, and then I don't remember how the process works, but basically they turn you back into soil pretty quickly.
Oh, wow.
Like within, I think, less than a month, maybe even, or 2 months. It's a very short period of time. And I think there might be a company, I don't know if it's the same company or a different company, doing it for pets now too. But I think you have to be pretty close, or they can send you back soil that contains your relatives so you can plant a tree or a garden or things like that. And then I've seen it in stories, and I think there are also places where they do that, where they'll bury you under a tree, or I don't know if this was a concept or a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, I saw a thing where they would have these like pods, and they'd put your body in it, and there'd also be like
Oh,
a
I also
sapling or
saw
something.
that.
But
Oh,
I can't remember if that was an actual thing or if it was just like
I
a
think I saw it
concept.
as a concept, and they were gonna try and make an actual thing, and then the pandemic happened, and I'm not sure if it became an actual
Hmm.
thing. That's definitely worth looking into, however.
Yeah, because I feel like I can't remember. I think it was in one of the Solarpunk anthologies. Someone like visited their grandma's tree in one or something,
Hmm.
like talked to them, kind of like we would at a gravesite now. But also, I think maybe being a little more integrated, since I came to Solarpunk through the steampunk end of things, without getting into the baggage of steampunk. One of the things that Victorians did that seems kind of wild to us now is like they would go and have picnics in cemeteries and things like this. And there was a lot of modern society, especially in the West, were kind of separated from death a lot of the time, except for at Halloween. Um, Otherwise, we're like
Yeah.
out of sight, out of mind. So we try not to address it. So I think that's something that would fall into that squishy bits of being human spirituality stuff. Like you said, both afterlife and death itself. I think some earlier versions of society, I don't know, did that better, because it's not,
Hmm.
there's not like, again, not that one true path. We've gone lots of squiggly lines through history, and it's not all one arrow toward the end of history. There are good ideas from the past and bad ideas from the past, and I think Solarpunk tries to integrate the good from the past and avoid the negatives as much as possible. And I think trying to reintegrate this consciousness that, okay, there is a cycle, there's growth and death, and maybe some of that's, again, the specter of capitalism, or maybe our desire not to deal with death is why capitalism is the way it is. But this growth without any death or any not even necessarily death, just slowing down or being more dormant, just the natural cycle of deciduous trees losing their leaves in the winter and going dormant. And agricultural societies would have been a lot slower in the winter, both from you don't have as much light, your only artificial light is fire, which is what it is. It's both very powerful, but for good and bad.
Yeah, so you're more in touch with sort of the rhythms of nature, and so more in touch with the rhythms of, I guess, a life and death, and seeing that reflected in the natural world is sort of brings it in more into consciousness.
That's one thing I like about. I hesitate to go as far as call myself pagan, but that might just be my Christian upbringing. But uh, and I don't really have like a very much of a practice or anything, but it's something I'm more drawn to now is like the wheel of the year and things of that nature, where over the course of the year, you kind of at least take a short amount of time to make an observance of, okay, this is the equinox or solstice or Samhain or Halloween. Like this is a change in the seasons. I may go on a walk and just see, well, how is the natural environment around me changing? Even if you're in a city, there are probably street trees, I hope, and grass and things. But just how's the world changing? How is the amount of light that we're getting, and how are your own energy levels? Like it's a lot easier to be energized in the spring, and in the fall it's kind of winding down, and in the winter you want to stay inside and drink hot chocolate and read a book or something instead of go out and play frisbee. So
sure, especially if you're in much colder climates. Then
yeah, because you're quite a bit further north, because we just moved down to the Savannah River here in South Carolina, so we're very far south compared to where I've ever lived now. So we're just starting to get fall now here.
Oh, really? Oh,
So
wow.
the leaves have just started changing in the last week or so, or I assume it's a little bit chillier there.
Just a little bit chillier, yeah, just a bit. But yeah, the idea of in an ideal solar punk future society, we recognize that the human can be affected by these cycles. Whether or not we choose to be pagan or choose to be animist or, in that future society, it's just a fact of life or a fact of death, that we're connected to the wider world, I guess. We're, in our context, we can't be taken out of it.
There's some element of that even in Christianity and other more Western paths, I guess, because they're all the feast days and everything. And in Christianity, there's Christmas, and Judaism, there's Hanukkah, and all the other sort of festivals of light that are in the winter time because it's your darkest times. And then like you have Yule from the Germanic traditions of, okay, it's the darkest time of the year, so we're going to have a celebration about light and the sun starting to come back because you have that darkest night, and then you start to get more light, because that's the part of the winter where you're starting to, in a more agricultural society, you're starting to check your stocks of everything you stored up from your harvest, and you might start being like, well, are we going to make it to spring? It's kind of a morale boost for getting through the rest of the winter.
Although just a disclaimer, I do know that, in the southern hemispheres, it's sort of the opposite. It's like summer and warm in the winter and that kind of thing. But we are embedded
from
in
the
our
northern
context.
hemisphere perspective, yeah.
But from the northern hemisphere perspective, this is sort of what it's, I guess, the ways in which nature affects the human.
Yeah, I assume, I'm not familiar, but I assume that southern hemisphere has, since so many northern hemisphere religions and spiritual paths follow that sort of pattern, I assume they have the same thing, just opposite, I guess.
Different traditions to mark the different times of year. Yeah,
but now that everything's so global, if you're doing Christmas in Australia, you're probably like, this is weird, but
I mean, we would find it weird, but I guess if you've grown up there, maybe it's not so weird.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I guess it's all a matter of perspective. But
yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today, Navarre. If our listeners, if our listeners want to learn more about you or Solarpunk spirituality, where can they go to find you?
So the main place is Solarpunk Station. my blog, which is just solarpunkstation.com. And there are several essays up there right now from some guests who are writing there. I have a short introduction post that I wrote. I think we may have one or two more people submitting something for that, but I don't want to name any names in case we're not able to fulfill that promise. But hoping to have one or two more people contribute before the end of the year.
Oh, good.
And then I have all my other ramblings of me either pretending to do engineering that I probably shouldn't, or philosophizing. And then I also have a YouTube channel that has a couple videos, and I'm even less consistent about that, but you can just search for Solarpunk Station on YouTube. And then a lot of other places online. I am Solarpunk Gnome on Sunbeam City for Mastodon. And I believe I think I'm Bartz Navarre on Twitter or X or whatever it's called this week.
Yes, whatever the whims of the technocrats tell us to,
yes.
call it. I was going to ask if you have any projects that are currently on the go, but it sounds like the Solarpunk Spirituality series is still ongoing, which is very exciting. Is there anything else that you would like to take a moment to tell us about?
I think that's the main thing right now. The only other thing I would say is one of my other hats is as a crafter making candles and science-themed decor. And so right now I'm a member of a co-op called Artisans Co-op that we just set up a storefront online that is basically trying to be a co-op alternative to Etsy. So everyone should check that out if they are looking for handmade items and want to do a better job of supporting the artisans who make the things. To check that out. It's very, very new, only a couple months old.
Definitely will check that out, and we'll put a link in the description so that our listeners can go check it out as well. Solarpunk Spirituality is something that I haven't really given too much thought to, and is something that I really do want to explore more in the future. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to sort of have a little introductory conversation about it.
Thanks. And thanks for having me. I guess one last parting thought is that if anyone is interested in looking at it more, I think bioluminescent that I mentioned before is a good place to start, because Lunarpunk does kind of bring spirituality more to the forefront than most solarpunk. Splitting hairs whether there's a difference between the two, but I feel like Lunarpunk does kind of take more of a spiritual tack with how we address things, where Solarpunk I think is a little bit more techy anyway. But
okay. Oh.
That's trying to put labels on things that shouldn't be labeled. But
well, it's not wrong to observe a trend, I think. We have observed the trend that Lunarpunk is perhaps a little bit more focused on the spiritual realm. And that's a good plug, I think, to go check out Lunarpunk some more, as it's sort of the other side of the coin of Solarpunk. All right. Well, thank you so much, Navarre. This was awesome.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again for listening. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay solarpunk.